Most men in Hawaii believe sexual assault is unacceptable. Yet, sexual assault is largely perpetrated by men. Many men do not speak up against it and are lost in knowing how to prevent it. We believe that men play a critical role in helping to create a culture free from violence by providing men and boys with healthy, positive, and supportive images of masculinity that are not tied to superiority or dominance. Today, we highlight the stories of Nā Leo Kāne and how the work they do in their communities helps to prevent sexual violence. We need to do better. We can do better. This is Voices of Men.
On behalf of Nā Leo Kāne, a Department of Health, Maternal and Child Health Branch initiative, we welcome all of you to Nā Leo Kāne's presentation, Voices of Men, Our Role in Preventing Sexual Assault. Funding for today's presentation is being provided by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Rape Prevention and Education Grant. The CDC encourages strategies that engage men as allies to prevent domestic and sexual violence. We would like to recognize and thank all of our partners and stakeholders who are committed to the primary prevention of sexual violence. We are also here today to honor the 20th anniversary of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. The goal of Nā Leo Kāne is to build the capacity of men and boys as allies to prevent domestic and sexual violence through understanding, trainings, and activities. We encourage reconnecting men's voices as sons, brothers, fathers, partners, teachers, and mentors to prevent domestic and sexual violence by discovering authentic masculinity and promoting healthy relationships. Nā Leo Kāne is a community initiative in Hawaii focused on expanding the conversation of what it means to be a man. We are committed to prevent violence and promote healthy relationships with Aloha. Nā Leo Kāne is a collaboration of Aloha-minded individuals and organizations that engage men and boys to prevent violence and promote healthy relationships by sharing resources and best practices.
Aloha, my name is Rosemary Vergara. I am the Domestic Violence Prevention Program Coordinator at the Department of Health.
Aloha, my name is Joanne Higashi. I'm the Sexual Violence Prevention Program Coordinator, also at the Department of Health. We were interested in engaging men in our violence prevention work, and we're curious to learn from them.
So in June 2016, we started by having lunch and talking story with several men at Aloha Bakery in Kaka'ako. We asked the men 3 questions: how his culture shaped your perspective of what it means to be a man, what factor has influenced you the most on your views on domestic and sexual violence and how you treat women and children, and what would be the best way to support boys and men to be engaged as individuals and leaders for healthier families and communities. The conversation was rich and meaningful. We agreed that more conversations were needed to explore healthy masculinity. So in March 2017, the group coordinated the Engaging Men Kickoff event at Pearl Harbor Rainbow Bay Marina, and about 20 men and women attended to take part in activities and presentations, and discussions included talk story questions on childhood, family dynamics, influence of culture, and masculinity.
Nā Leo Kāne was established in October 2017. We'd like to give a shout out to the Department of the Attorney General Community and Crime Prevention Branch for creating our wonderful logo. The Nā Leo Kāne logo is very special to us because there's so much meaning behind each element. The mountains represent men and their families and are joined to represent their oneness. The mountains are of different shapes and sizes, which also represent the diversity of men's voices. Notice how they are all even on the top? No person's voice is more important than another. The current represents the prevention of domestic and sexual violence. The sharp hook at the top of the wave represents the potential harm that domestic and sexual violence can have on victims and the community. As men join together in this community initiative, the current created by their voices will grow stronger. You can see the teal and purple colors. The teal color represents sexual violence prevention, and the purple color represents domestic violence prevention. The colors change from a wave into a canoe, also representing how Nā Leo Kāne's prevention efforts aim to calm what may have once been previously turbulent waters.
Nā Leo Kāne has partnered and participated in many statewide community violence prevention efforts. We partnered with the U.S. Army Hawai'i SHARP program to bring Jeff Buchholz from We End Violence and Keola Chan from Aha Kane to provide a training called #MeToo, exploring men's role in ending discrimination and violence in Hawaii. Nā Leo Kāne also partnered with the UH POW Violence Program to bring UH students and community members together for the Away from Violence performance to raise awareness of violence against women. Other events include the Celebrate Safe Communities Fair, the Men's March Against Violence, the Kauai Fatherhood Council's Men's Conference on Kauai, Voices of Men, Stories That Are Not Being Heard presentation, Safe Spaces and Workplaces training and discussion, activities for the Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Awareness Months every April and October. To build the capacity of Nā Leo Kāne, we provided strengths-based leadership trainings in partnership with One Shared Future, promoted and participated in Pono Shim's Higher Skills Academy on the Aloha Response, and coordinated Men and Can Stop Rape's Healthy Masculinity Training Institute. Nā Leo Kāne has also been accepted to present at the Association of Maternal and Child Health Programs National Conference in May 2021.
And finally, to expand our statewide community, we created a website and social media platforms to engage men and to provide local and national resources to promote men's health and wellness. Most important and close to our hearts, we would like to thank the men and women of Nā Leo Kāne who have traveled on this journey with us for the past 5 years. We've gained so much from one another, from resource sharing to opportunities to partner on community violence prevention events, to sharing a deeper connection with each other through Aloha. I'd like to introduce to you Pono Shim, who is the President and CEO of the Oahu Economic Development Board and is a gifted storyteller and speaker in Hawaii and internationally. Pono will speak on the Aloha response, which is the core of who we are as Nā Leo Kāne.
One of my favorite books, and is very precious to me because it was given to me from Nanaviri, is Change We Must, which could be considered Jediism. The Hawaiian said, Hinane ka olelo. The language is a riddle, rich in metaphor. The Hawaiian language was melodious and graceful like the people. Before the missionaries came and converted the language into the written word, the Hawaiians used figures of speech in a language that was like poetry. This use of the language vanished long ago. Hawaiians today speak the missionary language, a literal type of Hawaiian. The riddle is gone. When Captain Cook came to Hawaii, now imagine the brilliance, innovation, the self-reliance, incredible amounts of food. Now they saw our effort, they saw our production, and they saw our effort as what? Work. They heard our word for work as hana. So they interpreted hana as work because they saw our effort as work. And it's not. What is work? Work is something that you do until you can find somebody else to replace you. That's not hana. Hana is hana and work is work, and they are not the same thing. Ha-na. Hana. Ha-na. As we ha, we na. As we express our ha, as we share our ha, as we go to a moment of emptiness, we na. And what is na? Comes from that word noa. Noa means to unleash, to set free, to unbridle, to liberate. Nā, akahai. Kindness, grace. What is grace? Grace is you leave something better than you found it. So, na is unleashing grace. Leaving something better than you found it. Like what? Like the land. Like people. Like the rocks, like the trees, like the animals, the birds, the ocean. That didn't work. So as we ha, we na, as we express, we unleash grace.
There's no time restriction in the word hana, because you're doing it from your heart, from your core, from the last breath you get, and focusing on that particular situation. For our family, we're community builders, I'd like to say, and we also agriculture. So with that mash, I think we're trying to build a small community to make it food sustainable.
I've never thought of it as work. It's our lifestyle. You know, for us, we've gone to generations of this type of lifestyle.
So hana is hana. And it's not just the effort of work, it is sharing our hana. It's not work. Endearingly, emphatically, recover what it means to be hana. Now, you have o hana. And so what is the o? And Tipilahi said there are certain words that have that O, only a very few. That is a very unique O. That O she defined as eternal, eternity. O Hana, eternal Hana. Because if you're part of an Ohana, all that meant, all the members of an ohana, hana forever. That's a concept that we honor each person's hana. We have space for people to understand, recover, discover, innovate, improve their hana. And we honor and need each other's hana. That's ohana.
Limahuli is part of the Ahupa of Haena, which is in the Moko of Halelea. Really an amazing part of the Pai'aina of Hawaii. It was a valley full of abundance in food. This is really an Aina Momona. We moved forward with establishing the Hui Makainano Makana and creating Limahuli Garden here. It was a way of reestablishing that relationship for our people, for our community, back to the Aina. For us, that's our therapy, bro. We go down there, we take care of that. That's our therapy. For people like Uncle Tom, Hana was their way of reflecting that relationship to the land and to their community. And for him, it wasn't work. It was feeding. It was making your community healthy and making them whole, making things pono. It's really allowed us to regain that relationship to the Aina in a really reciprocal way. Every drop of sweat and every ounce that we put out comes back tenfold to us, to the health of our community.
And when I look at folks like David and Carol and Chipper and Holy, why are Chipper and Holy so successful in recovering the ahupua'a? It's because they're doing it as ohana. When people can understand the riddle which has been lost in its deep meanings, then they can start to understand the depth of the relationship that we had with space and place. When I share e ohana ho, for me it is actually a declaration now of our people. It's time to recover this riddle that is the foundation of who we are and the foundation of the prophecy that Auntie Pilahi gave, which is in the 21st century the world will search for peace and they'll look to Hawaii because Hawaii is the key and that key is aloha. So if we want to be a community again, a healthy community where we just thrive, I believe that we go back and we look at and remember when was it that we thrived and what was that foundation that girded us during that time. And the foundation that girded us was ohana. That hana, not ohana family, not hana work, ohana, eternal hana.
Aloha, my name is Chris Yano Arya, and I am the program coordinator of the University of Hawaii at Manoa POW Violence Program, and a member of the Nā Leo Kāne Collaborative. Pono shared so beautifully the idea that we are all one eternal ohana, and how it's going to take all of us and all of our efforts to create the kind of thriving society we'd like to see come to pass. As Sage mentioned, April is nationally recognized as Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Nā Leo Kāne Collaborative believes that preventing sexual assault is everyone's responsibility, and that each member of the community has their own skills and knowledge to contribute to ending sexual assault. So, what is sexual assault? Sexual assault refers to sexual contact or behavior that occurs without explicit consent of the victim. Some forms of sexual assault include attempted rape, fondling or unwanted sexual touching, forcing a victim to perform sexual acts such as oral sex or penetrating the perpetrator's body, penetration of the victim's body, also known as rape. Sexual assault impacts every community and affects people of all genders, sexual orientations, and ages. Anyone can experience sexual assault, but most victims identify as female. Sexual assault affects millions of people each year in the United States. The official numbers are likely underestimated because many cases go unreported. Victims may be ashamed, embarrassed, or afraid to tell the police, friends, or family about the violence. According to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, shares that in the United States, 1 in 5 women and 1 in 71 men will be raped at some point in their lives. 46% lesbians, 75% bisexual women, and 43% heterosexual women reported sexual violence other than rape during their lifetime, while 40% gay men and 47% bisexual men and 21% heterosexual men reported sexual violence other than rape during their lifetime. In 8 out of 10 cases of rape, the victim knew the person who sexually assaulted them. Now, when it comes to child sex abuse, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys will be sexually abused before they turn 18 years old. 34% of people who sexually abuse a child are family members. 96% of people who sexually abuse children are male. And 76.8% of people who sexually abuse children are adults. And on the college campus, 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 men are sexually assaulted while in college. More than 90% of sexual assault victims on college campuses do not report the assault. These statistics must not be ignored. Nā Leo Kāne believes that Sexual Assault Awareness Month is a critical opportunity to not only demonstrate our unwavering solidarity with survivors, but as men, to be agents of change, working to create a culture across the state that fosters authentic masculinity, healthy relationships, demonstrates care and support, and takes action to prevent instances of sexual violence. Historically, we as a society have assumed that the responsibility of preventing sexual violence and domestic violence falls on the shoulders of women and girls. Men are often lost as to how we can play a positive role in stopping these forms of violence. Now, primary prevention offers men a positive role to play. We can help to stop the violence before it starts by replacing harmful attitudes, assumptions, and behaviors connected to unhealthy masculinity with healthier and positive ways to be a man. Many men and boys are bombarded on the daily basis with negative, harmful, and violent messages about dominant masculinity. These dominant stories about masculinity can have a big influence on how men and boys operate in the world. Today, we're going to highlight counter stories about masculinity by having some of the men of Nā Leo Kāne share who they are and the efforts they are putting forward to reduce sexual assault and create healthier communities. Please enjoy hearing from the men of Nā Leo Kāne.
Hello, aloha. Name is Brian Alston, and I'm really glad in some ways and honored to have a chance to speak to you. Would like to share a couple of things with you about my involvement with the prevention of sexual violence generally. First, I would like to say that I'm part of the Hawai'i Fatherhood Council, a wonderful group of men and a variety of supporters who are female. Each year we put on the annual men's conference, and that conference has a different theme, a different focus every year. This year it's Health and Wellness Part 2. I also am part of Nā Leo Kāne, a wonderful statewide organization that's focused on the prevention of sexual violence. I'm also part of an initiative that the Kauai Fatherhood Council started, our Father's Circle, which is a televised program in which we get together and we talk about important issues from our own individual experiences and record that like a talk show and share it on public television. So a wide range of venue possibilities, and these are all ways in which I'm honored to participate. My life growing up was a bit different. I grew up in New England, right in the Boston area neighborhoods. And in growing up, I had the opportunity to witness and to see and to hear issues of sexual violence and violence generally, and violence specifically against women. And I want to share two ways in which they impacted my life in particular. One was in my own family. In my own family, I witnessed, as the youngest, arguments between my older siblings and my mom. My older sister, my older brother in particular, were very bitter about her separation from their father, their dad. And my mom would say to them over and over again, particularly to my sister, that she was too young to understand the challenges that were happening in the family at that time. And at some point, there were so many arguments that would happen, usually on a Thanksgiving or a Christmas when everybody was home, that my mom sat me down when I was about 12 years old. And she shared with me the history of violence that she went through in her first marriage with my older sibling's father. And she recounted some of the violent situations she was in and the physical abuse that she endured. And I remember how careful she was and how apologetic she was of telling me this, because she said, Brian, I have to tell you, these are the issues behind the arguments in the family, because I really didn't know. And she said, I apologize for telling you at such a young age, but it helped me to have a context for what was happening in the family. And what I saw and what I heard from the stories that she told me when I was about 12 years old, up until the stories she told me in her 80s, they were very consistent. And what was also consistent was my sister's denial of her pain, my sister's denial of the kinds of violence and abuse that my mom suffered. Up until the day my mom died, they were at a bitter odds over the relationship and the pain and hurt of that relationship my mom experienced, and the pain and hurt that my sister experienced without having a relationship with her dad. So that's the first thing I want to talk about, is mention that point. The second thing I want to mention was my experience of my mom's sexual assault. I was about that same age, 12, 13 years old, and my brother and I, we were in the living room watching television, early evening. And I remember hearing the keys at our front door. Keys, just shaking. And I remember sitting there on the couch and wondering who is coming in. It could only be one of my siblings in my mind, because my mom left for work maybe 45 minutes, an hour ago. And I remember sitting there, not wanting to get up from my favorite program. And all I could hear was keys at the front door shaking. Finally, I got up, and I must say, I got up with an attitude. And I went to the front door, and I swung the front door open, expecting it to be one of my siblings, and say, hey, why can't you just come in? And what I saw at the front door was my mom. She was standing there, shaking. Her hands were moving back and forth, back and forth. I didn't know how she even got her keys out of her purse. And it was a summer day, so she wasn't cold. And I remember looking at her, and all I could say is turn towards the living room and say to my brother, something has happened to Mom. And I remember just gently holding her hands to keep them from shaking, and I led her into the house. And as she came into the house, my brother came to the door, and what happened? He looks at her. She couldn't even talk. She couldn't speak. And my brother, looking at her, realizes that something happened to her. Someone did something. He runs to the kitchen. We had just eaten dinner, and the only thing left on the dinner besides the plates was a long knife. He grabs the butcher knife. He runs past my mom. I remember my mom reaching for him, saying no. And he takes off outside into the darkness. And now here I am at the front door with my mom, and both of us are like, oh no, what is my brother gonna do? Who is he gonna find in the darkness and assault or hurt with this knife? Finally, we were able to get my mom to sit down. And after 20 minutes or half hour, so my brother returns into the apartment and he sees no one. That in itself was a miracle on a summer night, that he saw no one. And my mom takes such a long time just to get her to stop shaking. And my brother's in the background, and he's committing himself that whoever's done this, I'm gonna stab him, I'm gonna kill him, whoever's done this. And I remember my mom at that point not telling us the story because she didn't want to give any more details to my brother. She didn't want him going to prison. And so it really wasn't until the next day that we were able for my mom to tell us the story, that she promised to go to the police station, but we could not go with her because she didn't want my brother to know any more details. And she went to the police station and reported the incident that took place while she was on her way to work at the train station. She was attacked by a man at the train station, tried to rip off her clothes, fondled her, and it wasn't until someone else came that she was able to struggle and get away. And would you know, weeks later, or months later, I don't remember exactly, they caught the guy. And she called me over and she said, Brian, we had the court case today. I'm like, really? She said, yes. I said, well, Mom, how did it go? And she says, well, they asked me a lot of questions. I told them everything that happened. And they had me point to the guy. And she says, I pointed to the guy. And she says, as soon as I point to the guy, she says, the lawyer for the man interrupts the judge and says, Judge, that is not the man. Apparently, the man had a twin brother. A brother that looked like him or almost a twin, but someone in that category. And she said, as soon as I pointed to that man, the lawyer had the real guy come out and said, Judge, that's the man that we're referring to. But she pointed to this man who's his brother. And she says, I remember the judge shaking his head. I remember the judge giving strong words to the lawyer for the tactic he used and for his apology to me that he had no choice but to let this man go. And she witnessed as the two brothers celebrated in the courtroom. She witnessed as they shook the man, the lawyer's hands. For me, that story and the pain that I saw in my family where she was not believed. And the stories I remember of how she called the police on her husband, and the police would come and they would say things like that to her, like, honey, what happened? Did you burn the dinner? Is that why he hit you? And I heard that from her. I couldn't believe it, but I saw it even in my own family. So that framed my early living, my early growing up. And I got involved right out of college in the area of substance abuse counseling, looking at alcoholism, working with alcoholics, because that's the kind of thing that impacted the father figures in my life and even my brothers. I got involved in working in a homeless shelter for women and children who are on the run from violent, usually men in their lives. Much of it having to do, a lot of it having to do with what I witnessed in my own family and the denial of my mom of her own experience. So even today, I would talk about the prevention of abuse and violence in the hands of men, the prevention of incest that was in the hands of men, so that we would be aware of how impactful we are on the lives of others. These are the stories that impacted my life, and I just wanted to share them with you. Thank you.
Aloha, everybody. So I'm David Matos, also known as Kavika, and I'm coming to you from Maui. I'm originally from the Big Island. I was born and raised in Hilo, graduated Hilo High School in 1980, and I've been on Maui since 1984. I'm happily married to my wife, Ka'o. In fact, we just celebrated our 34th year wedding anniversary 2 weeks ago. And we have 5 adult children and 6 grandchildren. And I'm really passionate about making sure that we raise children in a safe and nurturing way, and absolutely value family. I work full-time for a nonprofit agency called Maui Family Support Services. We have multiple programs that serve families and children, and I run a program called Kane Connections that focuses on serving men, especially fathers. I work part-time also at the Aloha House Residential Treatment Center, where I do life classes for the men and women in treatment twice a week. On a statewide level, I am also involved by volunteering with the Hawaii State Commission on Fatherhood, where I've been a commissioner now representing Maui County for the last 3 years and currently the chair of the commission for the last 2 years. I'm involved with the Early Childhood Action Strategies organization, where there are 6 teams, and I'm on team 4, focusing on family engagement and especially fatherhood involvement. And then, of course, involved with Nā Leo Kāne, Voices of Men in the prevention of family abuse and neglect. You know, many times people ask me, what drives me? What is it that makes me do what I do with this strong desire to help people? And a few years back, I was talking with a therapist, and she asked me those exact questions, but it was the way that she asked me to really look at why I do what I do that felt so important. And so after pondering over it and thinking about it deeply, a memory surfaced for me that I'd like to share with you. Now, I've always loved helping people, and I've always been driven to help people from when I was a child onto high school and then even onto adulthood. But now, bringing me to that talk with that therapist, unexpectedly, a memory came to me of being a child around 7 or 8, living in Hilo, having a neighbor who had a son a few years older than me that I considered a best friend to me, one of my best friends. But unfortunately, my friend used to get beaten on every single day by his stepdad and his step family. And it was heartbreaking because I was an empathetic, very emotional kid, and he would often cry to me. And in this one day of this memory, I remember I was looking out of our house window, and I saw his dad come home, and he was already fearful. We had greeted each other right after school, and I watched his dad come and very quickly started yelling and then began to beat on my friend. And I remember my friend pleading with his stepdad to stop, please stop. And he was screaming and crying, and no one interfered. And I am this little child staring out the window watching this happen and crying and praying to God that somebody interfere. And I saw years of that, and I felt helpless and hopeless. And as a child, that was very, very hard to deal with. We had our own level of abuse as well, you know, the way children were raised back then compared to now. Not only with, you know, you don't share family secrets or community secrets, but even just watching men and women, and especially for men, for boys looking up to men, watching men do and say things that were so disrespectful or inappropriate. And often in my role modeling of the men in our lives, uncles and family friends and so forth, I often saw not only alcohol abuse and eventually alcohol and drug abuse, but I also saw a lot of hypocrisy of people or men saying, do things one way, but yet we know they're also doing very bad things outside of the public's eye. I was fortunate that my father was a nurturing man who also liked to teach and did the best that he could. But it was those incidences like that and realizing that from a very young age that although I was a child and could not make a difference, I guess there was a promise somewhere in there that someday when I can, as a teenager onto adulthood, and especially now in these later years, that is very important that we as men have a voice and women have a voice and stand up against violence towards family violence and especially towards children's abuse and neglect. So in closing, I really believe that Nā Leo Kāne is very important for us as men to be a voice for our communities, to be able to support, nurture, and protect children and protect women, and also protect men by being an example of not only what not to be, but also to show and be an example of what we should be, for the boys to be able to raise our boys differently and help them become healthy, strong, nurturing men that will protect children of the future. In my men's group, we have a motto which I'd like to share with you, which basically says we believe that men should be respectful, responsible, accountable, and honest, have integrity, be healthy partners, and be effective and nurturing co-parents for our children, and be healthy role models in our community. Regardless of you or have children or actively raising any children, we should be that wherever we go. It's really important for us to be able to stand up against the way that the old school of making boys hard. Because it's very funny how we raise boys oftentimes very different from girls in a more hard or strict way perhaps. And yet when they become an adult, we automatically want them to become nurturing fathers and nurturing partners, which there is a mis-equation there. So I mahalo you for giving me the opportunity to share my story and honor you for being here today. I think it's really important for us to work together to be able to prevent sexual violence and assault, and especially towards the abuse of children and women. Mahalo for being here.
Aloha, my name is Eric Kili'i Bayer from Volcano Village, Hawaii Island. I'm an artist, activist, feminist, musician, educator, and advocate. I've been an outreach educator with the Teen Alert program, aka TAP 808, since 2005. As an employee of the Domestic Violence Action Center, I've been able to educate students throughout Hawaii about teen dating violence prevention, healthy relationships, how to be an upstander, and breaking down gender role stereotypes. Throughout the past 16 years, I've also been a coordinating committee member for the Men's March Against Violence, which brings together men from the community every year to address the issue of domestic violence and specifically men's violence against women and children. I've also partnered with Nā Leo Kāne for the past few years, and I've been fortunate to work with and coordinate with folks around the state who are actively working to prevent sexual abuse and domestic violence. Recently, I've begun to provide advocacy services through the DVAC helpline and provide more one-on-one support to youth involved in abusive relationships. It's very fulfilling and important to support survivors and train young people about preventing violence. As a boy and teen, I was encouraged to be open about my feelings and capable to show and share vulnerability. My parents were very encouraging and wanted my two brothers and I to be self-sufficient, respectful, and compassionate of others. So when I was about age 15, I went through a series of manhood activities and rituals where I read books, watched videos, and participated in various Native American ceremonies to honor my transition into manhood. This was not something any of my peers went through, so at the time it felt a bit strange. But still, I took it serious for the most part, and it helped to ground me and provided valuable insight into the positive aspects of masculinity. This helped me to recognize the true strength of men, not to dominate and control others, but to be a provider and use my strengths and privileges to help the world around me. These ceremonies helped hold me accountable to my actions and beliefs, while grounding me in the cultural traditions of my ancestors and family. After graduating high school and beginning my studies at UH Manoa, I joined up with a group of activists called Refuse and Resist. These folks really opened my eyes to a lot of injustices in the world, and many were outspoken and courageous feminists who were able to call me out on the things I still had yet to consider. This included the use of certain derogatory and sexist words. Refuse and Resist gave me a better perspective on how we must fight all injustices, and to quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., "No one is free until we are all free." In addition to doing violence prevention education, I spent about 10 years running writing, art, and drumming workshops with incarcerated youth on the island of Oahu. This program called Opio Haku Mo'olelo was focused on improving literacy and communication skills to adjudicated youth, and provided a safe space for the teens to open up about their situation through writing and rapping. Throughout the years, it was encouraging to see some of the youth committing to changes in their lives that would help to break the cycle of violence, substance abuse, and other unhealthy behaviors. Sadly, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I was unable to continue hosting these weekly workshops. Another huge influence on my life was being able to visit and mālama the island of Kaho'olawe. As a part of the UH Manoa Ethnic Studies Department, I was first able to visit Kaho'olawe in the early 2000s. After many visits, I began to attend the annual makahiki ceremonies in late fall and early spring every year. This native Hawaiian spiritual ceremony is meant to honor the ancestral ties to the Aina with the goal of regreening Kaho'olawe after years of destruction by the US military. As a counterstory to modern masculinity, these annual ceremonies view masculinity through an indigenous lens, while placing significance on the connection to and protection of our pai Aina. It's so important as men to use our strength to help and nurture the world around us, and being a part of the Protect Kaho'olawe Ohana has allowed me to help heal the land while capturing the essence of what it means to be Kanaka Maoli. As a musician, I've played saxophone in local ska band Black Square since 2004. This band has given me the opportunity to have a tight-knit group of men with whom I can have fun, be myself, and seek out camaraderie. Over the years, the band has changed members and been through some hectic times, including one winter tour where our van flipped over a ravine after hitting black ice. Thankfully, we all survived unscathed, but it was also a lesson in support, as this group of men survived something together and it made us that much closer as friends. The great thing about Black Square is that the lyrics are very political and focused on liberation, unity, community, and putting an end to the violence we see in this world. I've been lucky to have such a close group of men in my life to turn to for support and who I know have got my back. So how do we decrease sexual violence in this world? I think it needs to start with our own foundation as men and allowing ourselves to expand beyond the stereotypical image of masculinity, which is too often toxic in its very nature. With a focus on self-improvement, we can hold ourselves to a higher standard, be accountable for our actions, and feel encouraged to speak up about the injustices that exist in this world. This includes the amount of misogyny and male domination perpetuated in our society. If we can view others through the lens of liberation ideology, where we seek to see everyone free and able to experience equal opportunities, then we can decrease the competitive dominant structures that continue to oppress. When the views of women, Black, Indigenous people of color, and LGBTQ+ folks are given as much credence as that of white men, then we can move in the direction of true equality and equity for all. When we can teach young men and boys to be open, accepting, and capable of showing vulnerability, we can ensure a future where judgment, bigotry, and oppression are no longer the norm. When young girls and women can feel proud, courageous, and outspoken without the fear of any backlash, where their bodies are their own to decide what to do with, and the world no longer disrespects or labels women in derogatory ways, then we'll be better equipped as a society to feel safe, secure, and free. The only way to decrease violence in this world is to create a new paradigm, and that begins with ourselves. We can shift away from the antiquated and outdated structures of patriarchy, reconnect with the Aina, and truly value the feminine forces in this world. This is just one step we need to take to end sexual violence and begin to repair the damage that has already been done. Mahalo nui loa.
I'm David Nastong. I'm born and raised in San Francisco, California. Shout out to Frisco 415. But currently reside on the island of Oahu. I teach at the Thompson School of Social Work and Public Health at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. And over the past 10 years, I've served as a community educator, bringing the message of prevention to gender-based violence. I've led the Respect campaign of the Sex Abuse Treatment Center, where we engage and mobilize young adults to prevent sexual violence by having healthy, respectful relationships. Currently, we're looking to roll out our first ever podcast, 4 episodes, entitled The Respect Room, Bringing Light to Tough Topics. Make sure to check it out this coming month in April when it releases. I've also co-hosted with my boy Cristiano Waria a series of talks entitled Voices of Men, Stories That Are Not Being Heard, in which we talk about bringing healing to the lives of men that are hurting so that they can join us in being allies to prevent violence. A personal story about how I got into this work. I grew up in Frisco, Bay Area, and that gave me a lot of experiences. Well, when it comes to violence, and in the neighborhoods that I grew up in, which were predominantly Black and brown, we experienced higher levels of violence. I think a lot of it really was due to folks just trying to survive. Many of our community members were low income. They had the stress of living in one of the most expensive cities. So there was that pressure to do what you needed to do to get by. We also had heavy police presence in our neighborhoods, which added to the stress, right? And so a lot of us really grew up, and myself included, with just wanting to know, like, how can we make a difference? How can we bring ourselves, our gifts, to be able to bring some light to our communities? So I grew up really with that mentality. And as I got older, of course, I began to see that, specifically talking about violence, violence came in many shapes and forms. I remember having conversations with my female friends, having conversations and hearing stories from some of the women in our families that began to that they were victims of something called domestic violence, right? And at that time, I had never heard that term before, but hearing about their trauma and their stories and experiences really got me to think about just how devastating that was. And as I got older and then began to hold more stories of some very important women in my life that were victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, I really began to think that, one, this was such a necessary issue for us to talk about, but also there's something that I could do, right, to be able to prevent this from happening. And as I just continued in my life, then in my career, it just made sense that being an educator was the way that I wanted to get involved in preventing these types of violence from happening, right? I felt that if I could creatively think about how can I engage others to think with me, to act with me so that we can prevent violence, sexual violence, domestic violence, we really would be doing our part in making sure that we take care of the members of our community that are hurting through this form of violence. My connection to reducing sexual violence, I would say that as a man, my connection to reducing sexual violence is, one, recognizing that this country is built on a system of patriarchy, which really gives men, me, a privilege that we benefit from. But that's just the base, right? The foundation. Building off of that, I now begin to connect myself to reducing sexual violence by understanding that I now can engage and creatively think about how can we bring this education to our men, right? We know that majority of perpetrators of violence are men, which doesn't mean that all men are perpetrators of violence, but there is a correlation, right? A connection there. And then I also begin to think about, as a man, I also know that a lot of these men are hurting. Many of the folks too who do commit violence do have a correlation to being victims of sexual violence or domestic violence themselves. And so I now have this opportunity to not only recognize that the system, again, is really built off of this patriarchal form and how men can benefit from it, but also that men are hurt by it as well. And now my connection is that I have these opportunities in these spaces to talk with men, to think with men, and to creatively grow, right? Like we can grow in a creative, in a connected way to say that let's recognize our hurt. Let's recognize the forms of trauma that we've experienced as victims of the patriarchy, victims of sexual violence, of domestic violence. And now let's collaboratively strategize what can we do to prevent this from happening to others, to women, to men, to those in our LGBTQ community, those who are non-binary, right, who are not in that spectrum. There's so much now that we can do by recognizing those points. And so that's where I feel that my connection is to reducing sexual violence.
I hope you were encouraged by the stories you heard from the men of Nā Leo Kāne. Someone once said, whoever tells the best story shapes culture. I want to invite you into a new story we're telling, a story that highlights healthy counter stories about masculinity. This story can end with helping to reduce sexual assault and domestic violence in our communities, where fewer men end up in prison, where less family members are abandoned, where men have healthy connections with themselves and with their spouses, where more men and boys live lives full of hope, and the fatherless are cared for by positive role models like uncles and manongs, who believe, like I do, that we can choose to live a better story. So, what is your role in preventing sexual violence?
Ve'alina mai ki aloha, o vauna keia o Dania Kawilamahi, o vai koinoa. My role in preventing sexual violence is to continue to educate myself, my family, and my community about the effects of sexual violence.
My role in preventing sexual violence is to influence soldiers, family members, and DA civilians to change the culture and create a climate of dignity and respect, not only for our Army Ohana, but for our entire community.
My role in preventing sex assault is to engage men to be allies in preventing sexual violence.
To speak up when I hear inappropriate jokes that degrade women.
To create environments where people can explore the ways that our dominant paradigms shape and influence the ways that we think about this issue.
My role in preventing sexual assault is to be intentional in my words and actions so that I may continue to create healthy relationships with those around me.
성폭행을 예방하는 나의 역할은 생존자의 목소리를 높이는 것입니다.
At times it's difficult to remain in kapu aloha, in something that is not normal. My role in preventing sexual violence is to model what healthy masculinity looks like.
My role in preventing sexual assault is to educate young people about how to effectively communicate, how to establish and respect boundaries, and what enthusiastic consent means.
My role in preventing sexual assault is creating a culture that encourages men and boys
to healthily express their emotions in a safe space.
To train my community in vulnerabilities and risk factors that contribute to sexual violence, exploitation, and trafficking.
To encourage male presence and male involvement in families and community through creating safe spaces where men can gather.
Hi, my name is Roy Naparetti, and my role in preventing sexual assault is to provide primary prevention training through culture change.
My role in preventing sexual assault at the University of Hawaii at Hilo is to empower students through education to create safer living learning environments.
To support and empower everyone in the work they do, and to be a model to men and boys.
Promoting healthy masculinity to my children.
To create opportunities to be an example for younger men in my life and show them what it looks like to respect, value, and treat women with appropriate behaviors.
This way they are equipped with the knowledge to have safe, respectful, and healthier relationships.
To uplift the voices of survivors so that other survivors who've experienced abuse can find hope, comfort, and support. No leila, nā hoa vela like, e ho'olako kākou i ki a pono o talahu I kanaka. E motu kākou I ke aho o ka po e ho eha I ko kalahu. I olalo loa kākou. Mahalo.
This year, we heard the sad news about the recent passing of our colleague and friend, Malachi Mo Mamalanga. Mo worked with Adult Friends for Youth program for the past 20 years. A former teenage gang member, he turned his life around and earned a bachelor's and master's degree in social work. He dedicated his life to his community and was serving as the director of redirectional services to help high-risk youth turn their lives around. In 2017, during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, Mo was honored by Governor David Ige and the Sexual Violence Prevention Community Action Team for helping to prevent sexual violence and promoting healthy relationships. Please join me in a moment of silence in honor of Mo.
We hope today's stories and pledges inspire you to engage men in the prevention work you are doing. On behalf of Nā Leo Kāne, we'd like to thank all of our presenters who generously shared their stories and experiences with us. Mahalo again to our many partners and stakeholders who also share in the goal and vision of Nā Leo Kāne. We invite you to check out our Nā Leo Kāne website for resource information, and please follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Thank you for your presence during today's presentation. We encourage you to continue your commitment to raise awareness and prevent all forms of sexual violence. Mahalo.